Welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, where we have engaging conversations about software development and cloud engineering with industry leaders and subject matter experts. These episodes are created by the Great Lakes Tech Leaders, an online community of technology practitioners. Please come join the conversation by visiting gltl.rbn.ai. Again, that's gltl.rbn.ai. Now strap in, because we're deploying to production in 3, 2, 1.
Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Lunch with Tech Leaders. My name is Adam Oberhausen. I'm the Vice President of Customer Solutions with Right Brain Networks, and I'm your host for today. Joining me today is software and data consultant and friend, Tom Kowalski. Say hi, Tom.
Hello.
And it is also my honor to introduce Lancelot Carlson of House Heel Pay, the first of his name, co-founder of the Payment Realms, Lord of Ruby Development, Warden of Artificial Intelligence, Sovereign of Entrepreneurial Ventures, and Ambassador to the Great Lakes Tech Leaders. Thanks for joining us, Lance.
That intro was epic. Thank you.
Yeah. You remember the intro you gave last time?
No, I don't.
You didn't get the name of the podcast right. You didn't get the name of me or Tom right. It was rough. I'm not going to lie.
You edited the whole thing out, right?
Oh, no. Jalen, our producer, she just likes to keep it real. Like, there's no, it is what it is.
I'm so sorry, Tom.
So we're continuing our talk on Agile, my series on Agile here. And, our last episode, which was a month ago, we went over the history of Agile and, learned some interesting things about, the initial start of software development and, how these diverging methodologies came to be. And so I wanted to kind of keep going down this Agile rabbit hole. And I've got a little monologue I'll start out the episode with here, but then I actually want to hear, Tom and Lance's, your kind of first experience with Agile. And so here we go with my intro. So Agile, contrary to many beliefs, isn't about, fostering a blind optimism or unrealistic expectations. It's set up in a way to confront the harsh realities of the project's progress and capabilities. Agile tries to extinguish the dangers of hopeful thinking that leads teams to assure stakeholders that everything's on track when in reality it is not. Agile helps deliver the bad news early enough for effective management intervention. So this is something I kind of paraphrased from Robert Martin, one of my mentors and heroes. And, it certainly sounds quite negative. Like, I thought Agile was about, having fun and going fast and, executing. And it is those things, but I think as I've kind of gone down this rabbit hole of understanding the origins of Agile and what it really means, it is about measuring your speed and capabilities and eliminating this illusion that if we just work harder this next iteration, or if we just add 3 developers to the team, it just keeps things grounded in reality so that you can report to your stakeholders the truth of what's actually happening with the project. So in this episode, we're going to focus on how Agile provides managers the tools to lead and steer projects effectively. The next episode, we're going to go into the next tier of Agile, which is like how you actually plan the specific work, how you actually execute on your iterations, kind of getting further into the weeds. But for this one, it's kind of focusing on the management aspects of Agile. And so my brief history of like when I learned Agile, it was probably like 2014. The SaaS company I was working for brought in a consultant. We were pretty much doing a waterfall approach. He talked to us about Scrum. We kind of had like an internal workshop to do a Scrum sprint. I remember buying like a tiny book about how to do Scrum. I was like, oh, this is easy, little framework. It's cool. The company sent us to a 3-day offsite Agile Scrum training. After that, you take a test to get Scrum certified, and it just felt like, oh, I know everything I need to know about Agile. But then now here I am, like, almost 10 years later, like understanding the history and understanding, some of these methodologies that I didn't really unpack. I wish I would have gone back in time and like dug into these things more, but that's kind of, and so I feel like I learned Agile. I was like, yeah, it's cool. And then I just kind of started using it and didn't really think much about all the different aspects and the Agile Manifesto and all these things. So I'll kick it over to maybe Lance about your first experience with Agile and how that went and what you, or feel free to just respond to what I just said in my opening monologue there.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact first time I heard about Agile. It's kind of been this evolution of like, I was in startups and, I'd been an avid Hacker News reader and kind of absorbing all the things that other tech companies were doing. And when I started my tech company, I adopted Agile because that's what everyone was doing. I had worked on projects prior to that at startups that used Agile and weekly iterations and stuff like that. And I had a really, really good experience going on site to a local company called Menlo Innovations. And they have a really interesting process around using Agile. So I've had a lot of exposure in the beginning. I definitely made a lot of mistakes in implementing Agile, in my opinion. Other people may think that the way that the way that other people are advocating to do Agile is the way, and you have to do it that way, mainly around like measuring velocity. I think that things can get a little precarious with that because the kind of work that is expected and planned to do week to week is always different. And so when you run into rabbit holes and you're trying to measure the velocity of teams, it's kind of like, this quantitative analysis is being favored over qualitative. And it can be, I think, those are some of the bigger mistakes I made early on in integrating Agile, because I would be like, as a manager, I wouldn't expect, I didn't take enough responsibility for the fact that I didn't scope the features and requirements enough and think about all the rabbit holes enough, and expected my dev team to hit this consistent velocity because of it. It's like my initial thoughts, but
yeah. Good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Tom, anything to add with your initial Agile experience or the response to my monologue about this being, the harsh reality of truths that Agile is supposed to present?
Yeah, so our experiences are similar since we were, both working at the same place at the time that was introduced. And yeah, I agree with you. It was, I got introduced to it through the implementation, right? Through the Scrum process, an implementation of it, right? How are you supposed to implement these principles without actually going through and reading and kind of, internalizing the, original principles of Agile. And, I wish I would have, focused on that more now that we're diving back into it. It's like, oh yeah, and looking at these principles, it's like, sometimes I feel like Agile can get a bad rap, and that's because of usually more of the implementation, whatever framework and how somebody's trying to implement it, into their process. And some are good, some are bad, some, and when sometimes it's forced, different implementations, it could be bad. But if you look at the principles, right, and just read them, you can't disagree with any of them. It's all, yes, this is what, you should be doing in any project, right? It makes sense. Some of them, it's kind of like, okay, maybe it's all, it might not work in some situations, but for the most part, it works across the board. So yeah, that's just, when I think about it, because I hear, maybe that's why people right now, right, the title of Agile and process, right, like it might leave a bad taste in somebody's mouth of how it's implemented bad, right, of where they're working. So yeah, I'm excited to dive into to some of these implementations and different models that people have used.
And I follow a lot of these Agile people on LinkedIn, and it kind of feels like there's this trend to say, oh, the death of Agile, but then reborn.
Yeah.
So everyone is sort of rebranding Agile right now based on what we've learned about Agile, which is kind of meta.
Go to agile2.net or something. There's like Agile 2.0 coming. It's just like, come on, what the cuss word? Okay, so the first kind of management tool I want to talk about is something that in the research I did is this tool called the Iron Cross of project management. I think it's been rebranded as the Iron Triangle of project management because of the negative connotation of associating the Iron Cross with Nazi Germany. But that's just speculation on my behalf.
Hmm.
But anyways, again, Robert Martin, when he talked about it, he used the Iron Cross, so I stuck with it. And the Iron Cross basically says that every software project is constrained by 4 key elements: quality, time, cost, and scope. And to be honest, I had heard of this, I think, in probably college or something, but I don't really ever remember it being introduced in my Agile, when I was practicing Agile for the companies I've worked for. Maybe a project manager talked about some of these words, and what's interesting is when they talk about it, and I want to help, maybe you guys can help me unpack it, is that the rule of thumb states that it's important to recognize that you can achieve excellence in only 3 of these areas at any given time. So I want to kind of explore that. Like, is that a fact? Is that a theory? Do you guys agree with that? I mean, to me, it makes sense just on paper, but I haven't looked at a bunch of data to prove that that's correct or wrong. So I don't know. Have you guys heard of this Iron Cross, Iron Triangle? Have you ever used it? Any feedback on what I just said?
Definitely have heard of it. I've heard of it more in the triangle instance, but this makes sense. I think in the triangle version, they usually have 3 on there and don't have the 4th, which is weird.
Quality's in the middle.
Oh, yeah.
3 triangles are cost, time, and scope. And because theoretically, quality is never a knob that you should turn down. You should never say, oh, well, we're just going to write bad code to get this done.
Well, then the wording is a little bit weird on that, to say that.
Or value. Yeah.
Because more so, I think of it as you can control time. I think of it as controlling things. You can control the time, you can say you have some sort of iteration, and so you've controlled time there. This is when I expect something to happen. You're controlling scope by, making sure that scope can be implemented in that time period. And then, cost, well, you could do something where you've basically associated a cost with that time window. So I know Menlo, for example, will charge their end customer some amount of money every iteration. And that's how they do their billing. But that's how they, generate revenue. But at the same time, the cost is, 2 pair of programmers, for example, are working those 2 weeks. So that's how you control your cost.
Yeah. And I think the takeaway from the Iron Triangle, Iron Cross, is that as a, proficient software manager, you should be thinking about these attributes as dials that you can adjust, right? Are we able to move the timeline out? Do we need to move the timeline in? Can we, in terms of costs, can we bring in more resources to help us with the project? What can we strip away? Or what can we add to make sure the feature set's complete? So I think it works well with the Agile principles, because it, looking at the Agile manifesto and collaboration and being forthright about the reality of the project, you have to make compromises and sacrifices. And the earlier you can communicate that, the better the outcome will be for all parties involved.
Yeah, I think you nailed it right there. It's the communication is what it really helps with, right? And letting stakeholders understand. When you say oh, why can't this be better, right? It's well, okay, these are the constraints that we're dealing with, right? If it needs to be better, right? The quality is higher, right? Then we have to, adjust the cost or the timing, and it gives that visual representation that people like to see, right? Why can't we, have it this way, or why does it cost us so much, or what I mean? Yeah, it helps communicate it.
I do think there is some risk in trying to think of it as something that's infinitely or easily scalable quickly, though. Like a knob you can just dial up real fast, and then suddenly everything else just kind of falls into place. There's a book called The Mythical Man Month. It's pretty good. Talking about you can't just throw 9 developers in there and make one baby in a month, is the interesting concept behind that. So
yeah, we'll actually get into that, because adding additional developers is going to slow you down. So you have to make a bet that eventually the team's productivity will increase by adding, but you're paying that, you're making a bet that the curve of the degradation of efficiency will be outweighed by the new peak efficiency. So okay, so let's move on to something you touched on Lance, which is the velocity chart in Agile. And again, we're going to talk about two charts. One's the velocity chart, which kind of measures your team's week over week productivity. And then the other chart is we're going to talk about a project burn down chart, where you kind of like track the progress of the entire project from when it started to when it ends. And you can think of a burn down chart as just like, you start with so many story points of work to be done. And as we progress through our iterations, eventually you're chipping away at all that work and trying to meet your time target. So starting with the velocity chart, you're just tracking the number of story points that the team's able to complete. So story points are kind of an abstract concept. You think about them in terms of the unit of measure that represents the effort, complexity, and uncertainty involved in a task, rather than an exact measurement of time. So, each team kind of has their own definition of what a point is. But what's important is that if you're able to come up with a pointing methodology and track how many points that your team can get done, you have some reliable data as a manager to go off of, right? It's all about saying, okay, well, last week we did 32 points. I shouldn't report to my stakeholders that we can do 58 points this week magically, right? You have to, it's to be treated as data to express the productivity of your team. And I'll let you guys kind of chime in. So go ahead.
I want to jump in right there. So that like just tracking points, right? And like work being done, it doesn't really fit into Agile or, the principles. And it's kind of, what companies kind of threw on there to, so they can monitor it. Because if you look at the Agile principles, it's like, hey, this team is going to focus on delivering value and, self-organize, let them go and look at that value that is being produced. But, having to peek inside is not part of Agile. It's letting them go. The point should just be for the team and helping them kind of understand and helping them maybe scope out the work to get it more in that, that smaller iteration. But yeah, that like kind of what you said right there, like letting the stakeholders know, right? Like how many points we can get done, right? That's where it kind of breaks down right there of, the implementation, I feel.
Especially on teams where the points are not necessarily, indicative of a unit that's like same. So in my team, 1 point is maybe a week, and then like 3. I guess our points are based on weeks, so our unit is pretty standard. But sometimes they do exponential. So like 1 point might not actually mean a unit that is comparable to 2 or 3 points, which is kind of interesting. And then recording points is also a lagging indicator. And it doesn't necessarily, and there's so much confusion that can be put into that number because, you may be able to measure something like, okay, the team is going into the winter weeks and, after they've completed the work, you can be like, well, we didn't get through as much velocity because obviously Christmas or something like that. But is that useful? And I'm not entirely sure. Whereas like Tom was saying, using it as something for the team where we can sort of, with the developer and the product person, talk about, okay, how long do we think this will take? How big? What's the size? What's the scope of this? When we measure the scope that we think, and we can collaborate and use it as a unit on the team, as opposed to, and actually you can use that number with the stakeholders to say, look, this is what we think how big it is. Do you think we should work on this? And let them decide.
Okay. Definitely don't disagree. Like, yeah, I think it is a good point, Tom, to say like these charts are not part of Agile. Like it's a derivative process to try and, make Agile more visible to stakeholders or business people. So,
I thought so what was cool is that I forgot to mention that, I like to tout 37 Signals Shape Up because they have some good ideas. But they, instead of using measuring these iterations by points, they have what's called a hill chart. Have you heard of the hill chart?
I don't know if we covered it in our episode on that, but it doesn't ring a bell.
It's kind of interesting. It's just a hill, and you give the developer, they can move the point on the hill, where they are progress wise, and it kind of measures like, okay, this is the most amount of effort and work I've had to do is sort of at the peak of the hill, and now I'm like over that trough and coming down. So it's more of like the developer kind of can communicate where they're at in a more qualitative way, I think.
Yeah.
So
So I want to talk about burn down charts a little bit. And again, this is like the project burn down chart. And, I think what you see what you would see in a, let's talk about, an ideal scenario is you've got this velocity chart that has meaning and it allows you to predict your team's productivity. And then you've got the burn down chart, the project chart on the wall, so that when anyone comes into a room, they could easily look at the two charts and be like, okay, this team can do this much work per week, and the burn down rate is this. And what you typically see is that the burn down rate is slower than the productivity of the team. And so the first question is like, well, why is the burn down chart, if the team's doing 45 points per week, why is the burn down chart not being reduced by 45 points per week? And the answer there is, there's always new work being added because you're always discovering new work. Requirements are changing based on customer feedback or what you've shown to the customer. Estimations are inaccurate, where humans are notoriously terrible at estimating work. So, you end up with these two charts that kind of tell an interesting story that on one side, our team is, maybe producing 40 points of work, but the burn down might only be indicating half that. So, I think, again, when I studied the teachings of Robert Martin, he talked about the importance of having these two charts on the wall. And, it just makes it, anyone can walk into a room and understand in less than a minute kind of what the status of the project is and what the potential completion date looks like based on looking at those two charts.
I just wanted to say, like, I have been screwed. I don't know if I can use that word. I've been by giving estimates, relying on the estimates that those kinds of metrics give you as a project manager. So I would caution, pushing out the expectation to customers that you can deliver by this date based on these indicators.
Yeah, I would agree. I've always found it very difficult, especially in the leadership roles I was at and the work we were doing, because it felt like we're always heading into the unknown, right? With cloud architecture and, refactoring complex systems. And it was, I never had an experience where we actually tracked. We actually had a velocity chart that we trusted and a burn down chart that we trusted. When we looked at it as an individual team, and we weren't like, promoting this outside of our team and tracking our burn down per iteration, I think there's some interesting things there, and you can help the team kind of refine their methodologies. But yeah.
Agreed.
For me, it's the organization as a whole and, the teams within it and how they're communicating. And I feel like these practices work good if your structure of, how the teams and how they communicate is already, pretty well established. If you have, if these teams have well established goals that are presented to them, right? This is what needs to be accomplished, accomplish it however, you see fit. And when that's not clearly defined and it's just kind of changing and it's just maybe like tasks given from another team or project manager, I feel like that's where it falls down, right? It has to, like, all of these principles of Agile, it really just fits within that team that's working on it. And then when you try to bring it out and have like teams of teams and it kind of falls apart. I feel like you have to have that clear boundary between the teams and what, they're responsible for, what value they own for the customer, whether it's an internal customer, that they're making these for. I feel like that has to be clearly established, right? When you hear these other ways of implementing it, I feel like it falls apart if you don't have that. So I just, whenever I think of these, it's like, but that, if you have a terrible culture and, the teams don't communicate well, it doesn't matter how you implement this. So, I had to throw that out there.
I agree. I think, I'll leave it at that. It's good insight, Tom. So I want to move on to iterations, the concept of iterations. I always thought of them as sprints, and I do think there's a negative connotation with that word, with Scrum, always sprinting, never a cool down period like you have in Shape Up. Yeah, I kind of don't like the word sprint. I like iteration. And I think what I learned when researching this episode is that an iteration never fails, right? An iteration provides data. Of course, you want to get things done, right? The goal of an iteration is to get things done, but the actual goal of an iteration is to provide data about how much work we can get done. And that way you can use your iterations to, put together that velocity chart we just talked about. And I know we had some debate about whether the velocity chart is even meaningful. But anyways, that's kind of how the research for the show came out for me, is that these iterations are, you start out with iteration 0. That's when you're doing your initial exploration and designing, and then that really never ends. You're always exploring and you're refactoring, redesigning the architecture, but a goal of Agile is to get rid of that waterfall, mentality of defining everything up front, but you still have to have some idea of what you're going to do. So that's iteration 0. And then you get into your iterations 1 and 2. And, if you're doing Agile and you have leadership buy-in, I think circling back to what you just said, Tom, about if you don't have leadership buy-in about what Agile is and how it functions, it's not going to work. But if you do, and you can provide feedback about how your iterations are going, and you essentially use yesterday's weather to report on tomorrow's forecast, right? So that you're not making some promise if we just work harder. Well, what the hell do you mean? We're working as hard as we can. If we just add 3 more engineers, well, we could do that, but it's going to slow us down for 3 weeks, right? You have to, and again, it comes back to that communication and being honest. So my takeaway is that I prefer the word iteration. I like the idea of thinking an iteration doesn't fail or succeed. I think in Scrum, it was when I learned Scrum, it was no, you commit to the sprint and you have to get everything done. And if everything doesn't get done, you work extra to get it done, was kind of how it was presented to me. And that, I don't know, that's just a recipe for burnout. But if you treat, your team like grown-ups that are doing the best they can, and you do these iterations and you see what your outputs are and you use those outputs to predict your future outputs, I think it gives you something, at least an honest assessment that you can share with your stakeholders about your ability to be productive and where you're at with the project.
I actually like the idea that you can fail in iteration. I kind of liken it. It's just a kind of a loop. It's a feedback loop. When you're programming, you actually fail a lot more when you're learning, so if you're failing maybe 70% of your iterations, that's a good sign that you're learning, because, and you have to include not just the developers, but also the stakeholders. So, why did that iteration fail? Well, there was the whole team has to think about that. Was it the stakeholders that, didn't scope the work well enough? Did they put too much scope into that iteration? Was it the developers, or whatever it was? A lot of times I think that the stakeholders aren't judged enough on that criteria too, and they can fail the iteration more often than even the developers. So I think it's just inserting a loop. And what's interesting too about iterations is, and when you talk about sprints, there are versions of Agile that happen in a day, if you want to break it down that way and think about the principles. If you're trying to get a prototype out, for example, one day of work, you could have iterations in 5 to 10 minute cycles and get that feedback loop going. And okay, so we're not just sitting here brainstorming for an hour, we're brainstorming for 5 minutes. And then we're doing this thing for 5 minutes, and we're doing this thing for 5 minutes. I actually think it's interesting to think about it that way, because, I also do a lot. Not only do I program, I also do a lot of content work, and I've been using Agile to get myself in the creative process, get myself out of this mode of being so perfect about what I'm doing, and just saying I need to ship something in this period of time. It's not going to be perfect, but I'm going to learn something.
Yeah.
Nice.
Anything to add, Tom?
No, I like that.
Yeah, I mean, Tom and I, we've worked together, a long time, and we were always experimenting with the duration of our iterations. I'm a big fan of I've done the 1 day iterations. I think that's cool when you're in POC mode. When Tom and I were working close together, I think the team we were running kind of settled in on a 1 week iteration, which I think is, just makes sense for the business needs we had at the time. In the past, you've heard of month iterations. Those are way too long. Too many things can go way wrong in a month. 2 weeks, I think if you have a efficient, mature delivery team that can stay on course, sure, 2 weeks. But anything beyond 2 weeks, I would really question how you're making it work. But so those are iterations, and great feedback there. So kind of wrapping it up here, last topic is going back to the Iron Cross and what we know about our iterations. Like, how do we actually know when to turn the dials, and what are the right dials to turn? We've touched on a few of them. So the 4 dials are quality, time, cost, and scope. So, I mean, usually if you've ever been in the engineering seat, the first thing you want to change is the schedule. Like, 2 weeks into the project, like, we're not going to deliver this by the end of the year, right? So we need to let our stakeholders know right away. And stakeholders are going to say, there's probably very valid business reasons why something needs to ship on a date, right? Maybe there's a promise to a customer. Maybe there's a trade show. Maybe the competitors are, beating you to market. So, like, I think from an engineering side, if I kind of recall, I was always like, just push the date, right? Like, what's the big deal? Like, you want it to be perfect, right? As engineers, we're perfectionists. So you want it full feature set. You want it to be best in class. With that said, I know Tom wants to chime in and say, you got to get stuff out there as soon as possible. But it's very challenging to just say, change the date. So
for me, it's kind of going back to the iterations. You want to make the iterations as small as possible, right? You want to make the changes that you're introducing into any application program, anything, any change, right? You want to make it as small as possible so you can measure it. This is, the value that's coming off of it and everything like that. That being said, it's the smallest that you can. So then, it depends on what that is. And then I like to think too, it's iterations of iterations, right? You want to introduce change as small as you can, but that could be part of a larger sprint or epics, as some people call them, or initiatives or different things like that. So yeah, you want to introduce the smallest change as you can, but yes, that could be part of different, cascading hierarchy of iterations.
Yeah, you get it out there behind a feature flag as soon as possible, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of part of it.
So it's funny. I want to, the word quality is interesting to me. I think of this from the perspective of what you're delivering. So if it's something where you haven't found product market fit yet, that's your relentless pursuit as a team. That's the only thing you have to think about is, how do we get product market fit? Because we're not making money right now. We haven't found exactly that thing that we're looking for to get somebody to pay us some money. Now, if you already have product market fit, the quality is something different. It's something, you have to measure other things, but at the end of the day, you're wanting to create something as small as possible to deliver the biggest impact as far as measuring, did I improve my end customer user experience? Did I meet the thing that the goal that I was trying to accomplish? And so, yeah, I think you can control the other levers by time with iterations, scope with your stakeholder team being relentless and trying to figure out what that smallest change is. And then cost is, I think it's can be constrained if you're using iterations at that point. And then all you have to think about is, okay, what is that smallest change? How the stakeholder team works with developers to figure that out.
Yeah. I'll circle back to all those things you just said. You got something, Tom?
Yeah, I gotta go off quality because everyone, you think quality, right? How good is it? But I was listening to something, I think it was Seth Godin, one of his either books or podcasts or something, and how he defined quality is the adherence to specification. right? And that way you can measure it. Where value is, I'm going to say I'm going to do this, it's going to be like this. And then quality is how close you come to that specification, right? How far you deviate off of it. And that, I don't know, just gave me the perspective to understand it better and think about it and how I'm doing that. Yeah, I don't know if that helps anybody else out, but yeah, quality is that definition of how much it deviates from spec, right? The actual thing.
Yeah, and the research for the show, the quality, particularly of the code, was the setting that you want to keep your code quality high. Now, what that means is subjective, but because sacrificing code quality for speed is a false economy. But I think it touched on what you said, Lance. Like, you can adjust the quality of a feature or the user interface, right? Like, you might have to create a simple HTML interface, but down the road, if this is a quality fit for the market, you're going to want to make it dynamic and add drag and drop features. But you can. So there's these nuances of quality that I think we just really sliced and diced, which is a really interesting piece of this conversation.
The best things you can do for your customers as a stakeholder and your team is to figure out what not to do.
Mm-hmm. I love to go through a backlog and just start. We talked on this one, but I want to talk about every knob. So we've talked about the date. We talked about quality. Let's talk about, increasing budget or staff. And seems like a straightforward solution, but it's not. Adding manpower theoretically speeds up the process, but it leads to that initial productivity drop. So as a manager of the project, you have to be able to weigh out the pros and cons of that bet. I haven't really seen too many scenarios where there's budget to just randomly add a handful of developers. I'm sure there are in bigger companies. I've mostly worked for smaller SaaS startups, but never was really an option. And the idea of bringing in a new person with no context of what we've been developing for the last 10 years just always, there's going to be a big dip in productivity. So it's usually not like a viable option, but it probably depends on the structure of the organization and, the capability of the engineering talent you're bringing into the team.
Wasn't there in the book, The Mythical Man Month, wasn't there something about the exponential nature of communication too, or something, which is why that breaks down so quickly?
Yeah, you kind of start, the team size, can dictate the complexity of the communication. And yeah, I've never read that book, but I know I'm familiar with the concept you're referencing. So that leaves us with scope. Did you have something on the concept?
Yeah. I like to think of it. So the scope of the work, right, that a team can do, it shouldn't really change versus how many people are on there. You want to keep it like the two pizza team or whatever, right? The kind of smaller is better. If you want to increase more and add more people to do more work, there has to be another team, right? What they have to work on has to be broken out, right? That value that they're contributing. So yeah, you can add more, but just, arbitrarily to a team, yeah, I don't agree with. The way to do it, to add more people, is you have to break apart that, what you're working on, that specification, either coming down from another team or, being contracted out down to, an internal team. Hey, can you work on this for us? It has to be clear, the clear boundaries, the communication, what they're responsible for. That's how you increase that, or the amount that can be done, not just adding more that's already there.
And lastly, we've got the scope knob, which, based on the research I did for the show, it's like, this is the knob, right? This is the one that, can keep your project on track in terms of delivering, and it can help you to, just turn the project into something feasible that can be delivered at a specific time. Engaging the stakeholders in this conversation is key. As soon as you start talking about stripping away features, they're going to throw up their arms and say, we got to have this, this, and this. It's not going to work. But of course, if we look back to our velocity charts and our burn down, if we have trust in that data, we can say, okay, well, we either have to push the date or we have to scale some of the things back. And there has to be that back and forth and decisions on, what we need for initial launch and then what we can add after launch. There's all these conversations that should be happening very early in the project. And I think that, to me, that was, I think something I knew, but just kind of putting it all together for this podcast makes a lot of sense. And, negotiating the trade-offs. And I think one thing that stuck out is like, you want to make sure if you are doing feature scope and removing some stuff, you want to make sure you're never putting in stuff that's not important to the stakeholders. Like there might be stuff that's easy that we can get this done in an iteration, but it might not be the piece of the feature or deliverable that matters the most, right? So you have to find that balance too. Like you never want to report out on an iteration to a stakeholder and say, well, we got this piece done, and they say, well, that piece really isn't important. What we really need is this piece, right? Like before you commit to doing something in scoping, scaling back the scope, like try to avoid doing work that's not important to the deliverable, to begin with, because that's just a huge heartbreaking scenario, and bad for team morale.
Threads is a really good example of this implementation of scope. So Threads is this new social networking app that's competing with Twitter, and people don't realize how hard it is to actually release an app to 100 million users versus, really quickly versus just putting up a web app that can serve, maybe a couple thousand. But they did it. They accomplished it, and they scope hammered a ton. They didn't have an edit button. They didn't have the ability to do GIFs. It was the most basic. Why would anyone use Threads if Twitter had so much more functionality than they did? But they did, and they loved it, and it was more about fostering the community in interesting ways than the actual functionality of the application. But they kept iterating, and they kept adding these features, and now they have an edit button. Now they have GIFs, but they didn't start that way. It's really interesting.
How you liking Threads?
I love it.
Yeah. I love it. So I only know what X is, so I don't know Twitter. What are you talking about?
I never use X.
Okay, guys, that's all I got for today. Anything you want to, just tie a bow on before I wrap it up here? And the next journey into Agile will be to we're going into an iteration. How do we, what are the challenges of actually planning an iteration and, the actual pointing our work? It's kind of getting more into the weeds. We'll see, TBD, but that's kind of where my thought is.
We're sprinting.
Live. Something that is on my mind as I was working on this podcast was just like the whole institution of like Scrum Masters and Agile Masters, and this whole Agile industrial complex is my new buzzword. And it's just like, I've seen some things on LinkedIn where it's like, oh, well, this company, got rid of all of their Scrum Masters and Agile leads. And it's just like, it's always weird to me that like these industries develop out of a framework, and then you have people who have never written code, and I'm not trying to judge them for never written code, but like they're responsible for the Agile or Scrum process within an organization, but have no concept of what it actually takes to do the work. It just seems like it's a recipe for failure. It's kind of like, I don't know.
Or if you've never written code, at least have empathy, like understand what it takes. I know some people that don't write code, but they've tried, and they should understand that it takes time to get stuff out.
Yeah. So maybe that's a conversation for another day about, and you can apply this to anything. Like everything has a cert now. Everything has a, right. Everything starts with pure intentions and then becomes like a certified industry. It's just, yeah. So
PCI compliance, SOC, ISO.
I'll take this time to thank all of our listeners for tuning in to today's Lunch with Tech Leaders. We hope you found the conversation informative and valuable. I'd love to have you join us again for our next episode. We're going to discuss. I should know this. We got a little holiday break, so we got some time off. I think we're getting back to it in early January. I think it's you, Lance. You're going to be talking about the
assistants,
custom assistants.
Yeah,
that's what's on the docket.
ChatGPT custom assistants. I'll make a point to continue my exploration of those, so I'm prepared to talk. Looking forward to that. It's been a great year, guys. Thanks for, doing all these shows with me.
It's been fun.
yeah, we've got a lot of good, interesting episodes coming up next year. We're going to keep things rolling. We're going to hit our 100th episode. And Jalen's got a huge surprise for that, TBD. And I'll leave it at that. So have a great holidays. I'll talk to you guys later.